In 2024, something rare happened in Africa. A country chose ballots over bullets. Young voters, defying manipulation and intimidation, forced democratic change and won. Senegal didn't just elect a new president. It elected a promise of dignity for a generation that studied harder but earns less. A promise of fairness in a system long accused of protecting the powerful. A promise that sovereignty would finally mean something more than a slogan. But then came the ambush. $13 billion in hidden debt. Not debated, not disclosed, not voted on. A fiscal landmine buried beneath a democratic victory. Now the same leaders who wrote a wave of hope are staring at a brutal arithmetic. Lower prices or higher taxes. Jobs or investor confidence. Sovereignty or survival. If you care about how democracy actually works after the applause fades, stay with me. Because Senegal's crisis isn't just about one country. It's about what happens when political change collides with economic reality. And that collision is only beginning. What exactly is the problem Senegal is facing? On the surface, it looks like a simple contradiction. Voters demanded relief, cheaper food, jobs, accountability. The state, however, inherited obligations it can barely meet. This is not a story about bad intentions. It is a story about timing, structure, and constraint. Senegal's new leadership came to power with immense legitimacy but almost no fiscal room. A massive, undisclosed debt load shattered confidence overnight, triggering a credit downgrade and narrowing the country's options to a painful few. Raise taxes in an economy where most people already operate outside the tax system. Cut spending when expectations are at their highest. Or accept debt restructuring and absorb the political cost of appearing weak. Each path carries consequences. Each risks betraying a different promise made to the electorate. The real tension, then, is not ideology versus economics. It is democracy running faster than the systems that finance it. And to understand how Senegal ended up here, how hope walked straight into a trap, we need to step back into the forces that shaped this moment long before the votes were counted. Long before the election, Senegal's economic story was already written into its structure. For years, growth was financed not by broad productivity gains, but by borrowing quietly, incrementally, and with limited public scrutiny. Infrastructure expanded, budgets balanced on paper, the illusion of stability held. But underneath, liabilities accumulated faster than transparency. This is how hidden debt works. It doesn't explode all at once. It compounds in silence. Senegal's tax base remained narrow, constrained by an economy where roughly 9 out of 10 workers operate informally. That reality limited revenue even as spending commitments grew. External financing filled the gap, and as long as markets believed the numbers, the system functioned until it didn't. When the true scale of obligations surfaced, $13 billion, the cycle snapped. Credit confidence evaporated. Policy flexibility vanished. A government elected to expand opportunity suddenly had to manage scarcity. This was not simply mismanagement. It was a familiar cycle. Debt masking, structural weakness, until politics changed faster than economics could adjust. And when that reckoning arrives, it never comes gently. Because once the numbers are exposed, the crisis stops being abstract and starts becoming political. The shock came fast and it hit hard. The revelation of hidden debt didn't just rattle markets. It detonated trust. Overnight, Senegal's credit rating collapsed. Borrowing costs surged. Investors paused. Some pulled back entirely. What had looked like a manageable transition suddenly became a fiscal emergency. This was the first real crisis of the new government, and it arrived before any reforms could take root. The leadership faced an unforgiving paradox. Admitting the scale of the problem was necessary for credibility, but doing so exposed them to blame. Who signed off on this? Who looked away? Who benefited while the public remained in the dark? Finger-pointing began almost immediately. Within the governing coalition, unity frayed. Between the presidency and the prime minister's office, tensions surfaced. The debt was no longer just an economic issue, it had become a political weapon. And outside the halls of power, ordinary citizens watched with growing unease. They had voted for change, not austerity, for relief, not excuses. If this moment feels familiar, it should. Across the world, democratic transitions are being stress-tested not by ideology, but by balance sheets. This was Senegal's first collision with reality, and it wouldn't be the last. What makes this moment so dangerous is what lies beneath the surface. The crisis in Senegal isn't just about debt. It's about the mechanism that produced it and the limits it now imposes. Hidden debt thrives in systems where growth is politically necessary but fiscally constrained. Leaders borrow to buy time, time to deliver projects, time to calm voters, time to avoid hard reforms. As long as elections can be managed and markets remain optimistic, the trade-off feels rational. But democracy changes that equation. Once power shifts through genuine elections, secrecy becomes exposure. Numbers are audited, books are opened, and what was once a technical workaround becomes a democratic liability. This is the trap Senegal has fallen into. A government elected on dignity and fairness now governs an economy built on opacity. Calls to raise taxes collide with a reality where most citizens already live outside formal systems. Calls to protect sovereignty clash with investor fear and capital flight. Refusing debt restructuring may sound strong, but arithmetic doesn't negotiate. The system, in other words, is indifferent to rhetoric. And when leaders discover that too late, crisis becomes inevitable not because democracy failed, but because it inherited a structure that was never designed to survive transparency. The second crisis is already unfolding. As Senegal's debt burdens grow heavier, the government has turned to the people to shoulder more. But the math doesn't add up. Revenue is limited, taxes are already burdensome, and the most vulnerable are being asked to pay the price. Austerity measures are a hard sell when voters expected better. They wanted jobs, not more taxes. They wanted lower living costs, not fiscal discipline. But President Faye's calls for tax reform run directly into the informal economy. If nearly 90% of the population operates outside formal tax systems, where will the revenue come from? How will the government balance books without sinking the very citizens who voted for change? The core dilemma is painfully clear. A country without tax base or investor confidence cannot thrive on promises alone. And here lies the deeper political fracture. While President Faye insists on sovereignty and independence from foreign creditors, his Prime Minister Sonko holds a hard line against the debt restructuring that many believe is inevitable. Both are in survival mode with different visions for Senegal's future. They can't both win. In the meantime, youth who spearheaded the democratic revolt are watching, waiting. What happens when their hopes collide with economic realities? What happens when the promises of fairness, dignity, and jobs sound increasingly distant? Senegal's debt crisis has not only strained the government, it has fractured its very foundation. The political split between Faye and Sonko is now impossible to ignore. As the economy falters, so too does the political cohesion that once seemed so promising. In the beginning, the narrative was clear. A new president, elected by the people, would represent a break from the old ways. A youth-driven movement had demanded a better, fairer future. The promise was strong, the legitimacy was undeniable, but as debt and economic realities forced their way into the conversation, that unity began to crack. Faye, the president, opted for a path of national pride, refusing to acknowledge the need for foreign help. Sonko, his appointed prime minister, publicly denounced any notion of restructuring, claiming it would be a mark of failure. Their divide exposed the deep tensions within Senegal's leadership. Sovereignty versus survival, national pride versus global interconnectedness, democracy versus the financial reality. And beneath it all, a growing cynicism spreads among the people. They are beginning to question who's truly in charge and who's responsible for getting Senegal into this mess. The blame game has begun in earnest. Each day that passes without clear answers only deepens the divide between the people, the government, and even the ruling coalition. This is no longer just about politics or economics. It's a crisis of trust. What's truly at stake here is not just the fate of one country, it's the future of democracy itself. In a world of crushing debt, Senegal's situation is not unique. Across the globe, countries are caught between two urgent demands. The demands of their people for improved living standards, lower costs, more jobs, greater fairness, the crushing reality of unmanageable debt that threatens to unravel any gains made. As in Senegal, many governments in the global south are facing this dilemma. They stand at the crossroads of democracy and austerity, where the promises of democratic legitimacy clash with the realities of fiscal instability. This is not just an African problem. It's a global problem. From Latin America to Asia, countries that once celebrated democratic victories are now scrambling to maintain credibility while managing spiraling debt. And in many cases, leaders are caught between their international creditors and the urgent demands of their own citizens. Can democracy survive under such duress? Can it thrive when the very system that should be supporting it economically is under siege? In Senegal's case, the debt has triggered a socio-political crisis that could easily become a regional problem. If the country's economic fabric unravels, the influence of international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank will only grow, but at what cost to national sovereignty? Senegal's struggle might well be a bellwether for the future of many other democracies facing similar pressures. Senegal now stands at a precipice with three possible futures unfolding before it. The best-case scenario. In this scenario, the government manages to reconcile the debt burden with the democratic mandate. Through cautious reforms and international cooperation, Senegal can secure financial assistance while still delivering on the promises that won it its democratic victory. This would require an unprecedented political compromise, a balance between austerity measures and continued public investment in education, infrastructure, and jobs. The international community, recognizing Senegal's democratic progress, may be willing to extend a helping hand, providing debt relief in exchange for transparency, fiscal discipline, and targeted reforms. The middle road. In this scenario, Senegal continues to struggle with the growing tension between sovereignty and the need for international support. The government pushes through a series of reforms, but faces ongoing domestic unrest as the cost of living rises and public trust erodes. Debt restructuring remains politically sensitive, and while it may ultimately be necessary, it may come too late, too much damage done to the credibility of the leadership. While the country avoids total collapse, it fails to fully capitalize on its democratic victory, and economic stagnation becomes the new norm. Growth remains slow, job creation stagnates, and the promise of a brighter future fades into a gradual, painful grind. The worst-case scenario sees Senegal succumb to political fracture as internal divisions tear apart the leadership. Without a clear path forward, the debt continues to grow and foreign investors flee. Public protests escalate and the economic fallout worsens. The international community, frustrated with Senegal's failure to deliver on its promises, imposes stricter austerity measures, deepening the crisis. In this scenario, Senegal's fragile democracy faces collapse as economic chaos leads to rising populist sentiments and the possible erosion of the constitutional order. The dream of a democratic, prosperous Senegal is replaced by a harsh reality of instability. The future, then, is not fixed. It depends on what Senegal's leaders do next. But each path will demand difficult choices, and none will come without sacrifice. In closing, Senegal's journey is a wake-up call not just for Africa, but for the entire democratic world. What happens in Senegal could ripple across other nations where democracy is a work in progress, but the economic foundation remains fragile. The debt crisis isn't just a financial issue, it's a political challenge, a test of governance, leadership, and citizen trust. Can a country's leaders maintain the integrity of the system when the economic promises they've made come face to face with the unforgiving math of debt? The tension between sovereignty and fiscal stability is the defining challenge of our era. Leaders who want to lead democratically cannot ignore economic realities, nor can they afford to cede control of their sovereignty to foreign creditors. But finding that balance isn't easy, and history shows us that too much debt can devour even the strongest democratic institutions. Senegal stands at a crossroads. The choices its leaders make now will shape not just the country's future, but the future of democracy in Africa and perhaps beyond. As we watch Senegal's path unfold, one thing is clear. The struggle between hope and reality will define the next chapter in its history. Now, more than ever, the world must watch, because Senegal's story is not just theirs, it is ours. Thank you for joining me in this analysis. Stay tuned for more insights.